Hi everybody, my name is Kaye Garcia. I had the pleasure of doing my practicum with the Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction within the Strategic Services branch. I worked actively on the poverty reduction policy initiatives, and my primary learning goal was actually to learn about their policy implementation process, but this was also one of my deliverables for them, was to conduct a communications needs assessment to help inform their communications practices in preparation for the rollout of the policy initiatives. Government communications is very important. It's a primary means of sharing and disclosing information, advocating for change, and engaging citizens. If done well, government communications can make government more effective, more responsive, and more accountable. Obviously, everyone knows communications is very important, but it's one of those things that can be really easily overlooked and taken for granted. So as I mentioned, I was working on the BC poverty reduction policy initiatives. The strategy itself was a province-wide approach to reduce poverty across BC within the next 5 years. Recently, they held extensive public consultations to help inform that overall plan, and it actually resulted in an act that was released recently and the upcoming policy initiatives. Interestingly, one of my favorite items that got produced out of the consultations was a document called the List of Shared Ideas to BC's Poverty Reduction Consultation. The report was a listing of ideas from the public on ways that they thought poverty could be resolved. And that report was broken down and categorized into different themes and categories. And one of them actually spoke specifically to the ministry and its processes and things that they can do to make things better. So the purpose of the needs assessment was really to outline areas for improvement within ministry's communications practices in preparation for the strategy. So to guide my assessment, I asked several questions. What is the ministry currently doing to communicate with clients and internal staff? What does the public think about those communications processes, and what can the ministry do better? As part of my review, I reviewed a previous communications plan that was utilized for a previous project. I also reviewed that list of ideas from the public consultations, and I did a literature search of journal articles relating to government communications and health-related programs. So some limitations I encountered. The ministry processes for communications is not very well documented. The communications plan I obtained was actually in draft format, and it wasn't all there, so it was hard to find and get a hold of. Also, the list of shared ideas was an edited and compiled list. I wasn't able to review the raw data. So I'm going to jump right into key findings. In my review, I did find that there are some key characteristics about government communications that should be highlighted. So government communications is very complicated and unstable. There are a lot of legal and formal constraints around it. There's also a lot of rigid processes when it comes to reviews and endorsement processes and governance models. It's also complicated by diverse requirements. I did find quite a few interesting items after reviewing the previous communications plan. So internally, there isn't a lot of communications that go out to internal staff. Announcements are usually made by email, which may or may not get read by workers, unfortunately. The announcements are usually kept at a really high level, just describing the policy change itself, and it also usually includes a Q&A section and some script dialogue. The Q&A and the script dialogue is really just meant to direct workers on how to communicate the change and discuss it with clients if they have questions. As far as communicating externally, most announcements are made through the ministry webpage. Sometimes there is some communications that go out in the form of information letters to the clients, so they get mailed a physical letter describing the change. Not always, just because there are some cost constraints with mailing out items. And also, at times there's usually some sort of messaging on check stubs, which are payment invoices that clients would receive monthly if they're signed up for mail services. Also, there's usually sometimes notifications that get sent out to clients if they're signed up for the self-service portal. I did want to highlight, so I did mention the ministry webpage. Interestingly, most of the information about programs and services are on the ministry webpage under their policy and procedure manual. Interestingly though, this is not targeted to clients. It's actually the exact same policy and procedure manual as it is for between like client staff, the public, and ministry staff. It's the same information across the board. From the ministry's perspective, the information is succinct and easy to understand. It's very information-based, but as I said, it's not targeted to the client level. So I found that there are two primary groups that are responsible for government communications or developing government communications. There's GCPE, which is the Government Communications and Public Engagement Group, and there's also internal staff. GCPE, interestingly, they're not made up of ministry employees. They're actually appointed by the current government to ministries, and they're primarily responsible for communicating changes out at a strategic level, and they oversee all communications that's released publicly. From the internal ministry staff communications development team, that usually consists of communications analysts, project managers, and community relations and service quality managers. And they develop internal and external communications as well, but on a more detailed, specific level about very specific policy changes and how they affect clients. On the right there, this is the complex governance model that all communications that go to the public have to go through. So each process usually, like each body can usually take 1 or 2 weeks, if not more, to get reviewed and endorsed, and it usually goes back and forth. So it is a very convoluted and exhaustive process. I also want to point out when GCPE is in charge of like strategic communications, there's not a lot of downward communications. So the project managers usually don't have a lot of insight on what communications is going to be released on a strategic level, because it really would only get usually reviewed at the ED level, maybe to the ADM, and then the conversations happen with GCPE. There's no downwards communications until it's actually formally released to the public. So when I reviewed the list of shared ideas, there are really 5 main themes that emerged out of that. The public's really calling for clarification of services. They want better communications materials. They want a new website that's easy to understand and easy to navigate. And they want the services to be simplified. They also really want the ministries to collaborate more with one another and utilize the information sharing. In reviewing the literature, I found that government communications was most effective when this criteria was being met. So if the communication was less ambiguous, if they were mindful of the communication channel that was being used, if the message was well framed, and if it was aimed at addressing basic needs, and that enrollment process was simplified. It's also important that outreach activities are utilized to their full capacity. And it's important that government develop partnerships and feedback mechanisms for ongoing support. It's also important that ethical guidelines are in place for the public to hold government accountable to those things. I came up with 3 primary suggestions out of the communications needs assessment. So the government communications need to take on a more client-centered approach. The results of the public consultations provided some really key feedback of what the public actually wants. There really needs to be some prioritization that needs to happen to create an action plan to enact all those things. Also, the ministry really should be utilizing some best practices and not just, I find a lot of it is, how do I say that without sounding mean? They need to really just be more mindful of how they're communicating with clients and really put some rigor around the guidelines that they're using. Yeah. Thank you. And I want to thank everybody at Strategic Services Branch. They were so lovely and great to work with. And everybody on the faculty, Kathy and Betty and Caitlin, you guys were all so great.
Hello.
Hi.
That was a great presentation. Thank you
Thanks.
so much. Super interesting. As somebody who has worked kind of in frontline service delivery with people living in poverty and homelessness, communicating these kinds of things often falls to those direct service providers. And I really hope that your suggestions are heard and taken seriously, like public engagement and more client-centered approaches. So on that note, I guess I'm curious if you have any kind of specific strategies. Like a lot of people living in homelessness don't have access to direct mail out, or have limited access to direct mail out kind of things, or like web page announcements, these kinds of things. Did you learn of or hear of any good strategies for engaging?
So the ministry is working on implementing quite a few more outreach activities. So recently they did a big hire for more outreach workers. So that should be promising, because I know that they are trying to ramp up a lot of their more community-based, like on the streets approach. So that should help with that.
Okay. All right. Good. Well, thank you very much. That was excellent.